The harbor at Hatteras was still dark when Mara Calloway walked down the dock for the last time. It was 4:28 in the morning. She knew the time without looking because she had been walking this dock at 4:28 in the morning since she was 18 years old. And before that, she had been walking it at her father's side since she was 4. And the body learns a harbor the way it learns breathing, without instruction, without effort, without the possibility of forgetting. The Miss Agnes sat in her slip at the far end of the commercial pier, lit by a single dock light that threw long shadows across the weathered planking. She was a 38-foot trawler, low and wide, and salt-stained, with a wheelhouse that smelled of diesel and coffee and the particular combination of mildew and machine oil that Mara had always associated with safety. The brass ship's clock on the wheelhouse bulkhead read 4:29. It had read the correct time every morning of Mara's life. Her grandfather Seamus had mounted it there in 1981. Her father Derry had wound it every Sunday morning without fail for 34 years. It still kept better time than the clock on Mara's phone. The buyer was already there. He was a charter captain from Virginia Beach named Tolliver. A large sunburned man in his 50s, with the kind of handshake that announces itself before it arrives. He had driven down the night before and slept in his truck in the parking lot above the harbor, which Mara respected without mentioning. A man who sleeps in his truck to be at the dock before dawn understands something true about boats. They did not speak much. There was not much to say that the paperwork had not already said. Mara had signed the bill of sale in the county clerk's office 3 days earlier. The Miss Agnes belonged to Tolliver now. What remained was only the leaving. Tolliver started the engine. The old Cummins diesel turned over with the low, patient rumble that Mara had heard 10,000 times the sound that had meant her entire life, that the day was beginning and the work was real and the world outside the harbor was waiting. The sound hit her somewhere behind the sternum, and she stood with her hands in the front pocket of her canvas jacket and let it hit her. Tolliver cast off the stern line himself. He looked at Mara once, and in the specific way of men who have spent their lives around water. He understood that she did not want to be spoken to, and he nodded once instead, which was the right thing, and then he stepped up into the wheelhouse and put the Miss Agnes in reverse and backed her slowly out of the slip she had occupied for 31 years. Mara watched the bow clear the pilings. She watched Tolliver bring the stern around to point toward the harbor mouth. She watched the Miss Agnes move away from her across the dark water. The running lights green on the starboard bow and red on the port. The stern light white and small and getting smaller, until the trawler rounded the jetty and the lights disappeared, and there was nothing where the Miss Agnes had been except the black water of Hatteras Harbor and the sound of small waves against the pilings. She stood there for a while after. The dock light hummed above her. A pelican landed on the piling at the end of the slip and sat there in the manner of pelicans, which is to say, with the absolute authority of a creature that has been doing the same thing on the same piling since before any of the current troubles began. Mara was 22 years old. She had no home, no boat, no income, and no plan. She had a canvas sea bag with her father's personal effects, a rented room above a fish house in Hatteras Village that cost $400 a month, and $120,000 in a checking account that she had not touched and did not intend to touch because the money was not hers. The money was the Callaways. 4 generations of mortgage payments and slip fees and fuel bills and net repairs and engine overhauls and Coast Guard inspections compressed into a wire transfer, and Mara was holding it in trust for a purpose she had not yet understood. She picked up her sea bag and walked back up the dock in the dark. The Callaway family had been on Hatteras Island for 4 generations, which on the Outer Banks is not a long time, but is long enough to be considered permanent. On the Outer Banks, permanence is measured differently than it is inland. Inland permanence means roots. On a barrier island, permanence means you stayed through the storms, and the storms come for everything eventually, and the people who are still there afterward are the people the island keeps. Cormac Calloway had arrived on the Outer Banks in 1908. The son of a lobsterman from Pemaquid, Maine, who had gone broke when the season failed 3 years in a row and had sent his oldest son south with $40 and a set of tools, and the advice that there was always work for a man who could build things near water. Cormac was 20 years old. He spoke little and worked hard, and had a quality that foremen on construction projects recognized and valued, which was that he always arrived slightly before he was expected and never left until the job was done. He found work almost immediately in the building trades along the Outer Banks, which in the first decade of the 20th century were engaged in the construction of the U.S. life-saving service infrastructure along the barrier islands, the stations, the boathouses, the watchtowers, the ramps that the surfmen used to launch their rescue boats into the Atlantic surf in conditions that would have kept most men on shore. In the fall of 1910, Cormac Calloway was hired onto the crew that would build the life-saving station on the barrier island 12 miles north of Hatteras. He was 22 years old. He worked on that station for 11 months through a winter so cold that the mortar froze in the buckets before they could apply it and had to be kept warm over coal fires. He laid the foundation. He raised the wall framing. He built the signal tower from the base up course by course until the square wooden tower rose from the center of the station roof, and you could see it from 3 miles out at sea on a clear day. Before he nailed the last piece of sheathing over the interior framing of the tower's main structural beam, he took a carpenter's chisel and cut his name into the face of the wood. Cormac Calloway, 1911. He did not tell anyone he had done this. He did not need anyone to know. He simply needed it to be there the way a man needs to mark the work that cost him something. Then he nailed the sheathing over it and went on to the next job. Cormac settled on Hatteras permanently in 1919, married a woman named Ruth Gaskell, whose family had been on the island since the 1840s, and began fishing commercially out of Hatteras Harbor. He built a small house on the sound side of the island, using the same skills that had built the life-saving station, working evenings and weekends over 2 years until the house stood solid and square on its lot, with a small dock running out over the sound water. He had 2 sons. The older son, Seamus, stayed on the island and fished. The younger son went to Raleigh and became an accountant, and was politely not discussed at family dinners. Seamus Calloway married a woman named Agnes Pruitt from Ocracoke Island in 1961. Agnes was a practical woman with a gift for numbers and an absolute refusal to be surprised by anything. She kept the family's accounts in a small green ledger at the kitchen table every evening after supper, entering the day's catch by species and price, and calculating the running balance with a mechanical pencil that she sharpened over the sink every Sunday morning. She knew to the penny what a pound of bluefish was worth in 1965, and what it was worth in 1975. And she knew the difference, and she knew what the difference meant for how the family lived. Agnes taught her granddaughter Mara to keep a ledger when Mara was 10 years old. They sat at the same kitchen table, the green ledger open between them, and Agnes showed her the columns: date species, pounds, price per pound, total, running balance. They did this every evening for 2 years until the habit became instinct, and the instinct became the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands rather than the head. What Agnes was actually teaching her, though Mara would not understand this until much later, was not bookkeeping. It was attention. The ledger was not a record of what had happened. It was a tool for paying attention to what was happening right now in this season, at this price, with this boat, in this water. A fishing family did not survive by catching the most fish. A fishing family survived by knowing precisely what each fish was worth, and where the money went, and how much margin remained between this month and next month and the month after that. Agnes understood this in her bones, and she put it into Mara's bones at the kitchen table, one column at a time. Agnes died when Mara was 18. A stroke at home on a Tuesday afternoon in February. The green ledger was open on the table. The last entry was in Agnes's neat, mechanical hand, the date, the species, the price, the total, the running balance. Everything accounted for. Everything in its column. Derry kept the ledger on the kitchen shelf after that. He did not write in it. He kept it there the way a man keeps something he is not ready to close. Derry Calloway was not a man who talked about what mattered to him. He was a third-generation commercial fisherman on a barrier island, which is to say he came from a long line of men who expressed the important things through action and left the words for people who had more time than they knew what to do with. He expressed love by showing up at 4:30 in the morning. He expressed respect by handing a task to someone without explaining it first. He expressed pride by not saying anything at all when something was done correctly, because saying something would imply that he had expected it might be done wrong. He had taken Mara on the Miss Agnes from the time she was 4 years old. Too young, most people said. Derry did not listen to most people because his grandfather Cormac had been on his father's lobster boat at 4, and Seamus had been on Cormac's trawler at 4, and the Callaways did not believe that the ocean became safer if you waited to learn it. The ocean was not safe. That was the entire point. You learned it young so that its dangers became familiar before they became dangerous. By the time Mara was 6, she could coil a dock line, the flat spiral, not the figure 8. Derry had opinions about figure 8s that he expressed by silently uncoiling whatever had been done wrong and recoiling it without looking at the person who had done it wrong. Mara never made a figure 8 after the first time. By the time she was 8, she could read a tide chart and predict the turn at Oregon Inlet within 20 minutes. By the time she was 10, she could read a weather change coming across Pamlico Sound by the color of the sky above the mainland, a specific yellow-gray that meant a squall line was building over the coastal plain and would arrive at the island in roughly 90 minutes. By the time she was 12, Derry let her take the helm of the Miss Agnes for the first time in the protected water of the Sound on a flat September afternoon, and she brought the trawler in a slow, wide circle while Derry stood at the stern with his arms folded and his ball cap pulled low, and an expression that Mara, looking back years later, would recognize as a father confirming that his daughter's hands are exactly the right hands for this particular work. Her mother, Kara, had died when Mara was 4 years old. A car accident on Highway 12 during a nor'easter. A patch of black ice on the bridge over Oregon Inlet. A pickup truck crossing the center line. Mara had no clear memory of her. She had photographs. She had the smell of a specific hand lotion that she sometimes encountered in stores and that hit her somewhere behind the eyes before she could prepare for it. She had Derry's silence on the subject, which was its own kind of testimony. Her sister Sloane was 3 years older, and from childhood a different kind of girl entirely. Where Mara was her father's daughter, outdoor physical, comfortable with cold mornings and diesel fumes, and the meditative boredom of a slow afternoon, trolling in flat water. Sloane was their mother's daughter, bookish and indoor, and restless in the way of people whose minds run faster than their current circumstances. Sloane had loved the island the way you love a place you are planning to leave. Mara had loved it the way you love the only place you have ever been. Sloan left for East Carolina University at 18 on a partial scholarship and a determination that had no room in it for looking backward. She studied business administration, graduated, went to work for a commercial real estate development firm in Raleigh, and was within 5 years the kind of person who spoke about square footage and cap rates with the fluency of someone who had been speaking that language their entire life. She came back to Hatteras for Thanksgiving and Christmas and 2 weeks in August, and the August visits felt to Mara less like homecomings and more like expeditions into unfamiliar territory, which Sloane navigated with the polite bewilderment of a person who can no longer quite believe she grew up here. They loved each other across the distance of these different inheritances. They did not always understand each other. The love was real and the distance was real, and both things were true at the same time, which is how it usually is with sisters. Mara had not gone to college. She had finished high school in Hatteras and gone directly on to the Miss Agnes with her father, the fourth generation of Callaways, fishing commercially out of Hatteras Harbor. She spent 4 years learning the full trade, not just the helming and the line handling she had learned as a child, but the engine maintenance and the electronics and the ice buying and the fuel buying and the fish selling and the slip fees and the insurance and the Coast Guard inspections. The whole grinding daily arithmetic of keeping a working trawler operational in a century when the fish were getting fewer and the regulations were getting thicker and the diesel was getting more expensive every season. Those 4 years were the best years of her life. She would not have said so at the time, because at the time they mostly felt like work. But Derry had treated her from her first full working day on the boat, not as a daughter, but as crew. He expected her at the dock at 4:30. He expected her to have checked the weather before she arrived. He expected her to know which bait to rig and which channel to run on the VHF and which slip to back into at the end of the day, and he had never once explained any of it twice. The meeting of those expectations day after day for 4 years was the closest thing to a conversation about love that she and Derry ever had. He was proud of her. He did not say it often. He said it by showing up at 4:29 on the mornings when it was her turn to be there first. In the fall of the year, Mara turned 22. Derry Calloway began coming home slightly earlier in the evenings than he used to. He began, without mentioning it, leaving the heavier work to Mara on the boat. He began sitting in his recliner after supper, rather than going out to the dock to check the lines the way he had done every evening of his working life. Mara noticed these things. She did not ask about them. In the Calloway family, you did not ask about things that another person was not ready to tell you. On a Tuesday evening in early November, Derry fell asleep in the recliner, watching the Weather Channel. Mara covered him with the wool blanket from the back of the couch, the same blanket Agnes had knitted in 1979, and went upstairs to bed. She came downstairs at 4:15 the next morning to start the coffee and found him in the same position. He had the look of a man who had simply decided quietly and without drama not to wake up, which was probably exactly what had happened. The coffee maker was still off. The Weather Channel was showing a low pressure system building off Cape Hatteras. The brass ship's clock on the shelf above the fireplace, the one that had lived on the Miss Agnes bulkhead, until Derry brought it inside after he sold the boat. Except he hadn't sold the boat yet, that came later. In this moment, the clock was still here. Read 4:17. Derry Calloway was 57 years old. He had been a commercial fisherman his entire adult life. He had fished in weather that would have ended most men's careers. He had kept his boat running through 30 years of rising costs and falling fish populations and regulatory changes and 2 Category 3 hurricanes that had come within a few hours of ending the Miss Agnes permanently. He had raised 2 daughters alone after their mother's death without asking for help, except when it showed up on the porch in the form of a casserole or a ride to school or a Sunday dinner invitation from the Ackermans or the Whaley family or the Midgets, who had understood without being told that a widowed fisherman with two girls under 10 needed the kind of support that doesn't announce itself. The funeral filled the Methodist church in Buxton completely and then spilled out into the churchyard. Fishing men came from all over the island. Men who had fished beside Derry for 20 years. Men whose fathers had fished beside Seamus, one old man of 83, who said he had played cards with Cormac Calloway and wanted to pay his respects to the line. They stood in their khaki pants and their button shirts and their salt-stained ball caps held at their sides, and they did not say much, because fishing men on Hatteras do not say much at funerals. But they came. The coming was the thing. Sloane arrived the morning of the funeral and stayed 4 days. In those 4 days, she was everything their mother would have been proud of, and everything their father would have found completely baffling. She filed the death certificate, processed the insurance claim, contacted the bank, located the deed and the mortgage documents, and sorted the estate with the clean efficiency of a person who deals with property transactions every working day and understands that clarity is a form of kindness. On the evening of the 4th day, she sat down with Mara at the kitchen table. The same table where Agnes had kept the green ledger. The same table where Derry had eaten his oatmeal every morning at 4:20 for 31 years. Sloane put a folder on the table and opened it. The property taxes on the house had not been paid in 2 years. Derry had let the homeowner's insurance lapse 14 months before his death. The mortgage had a remaining balance of $108,000. The trawler's insurance had also lapsed, and the Cummins engine needed a rebuild that would cost somewhere between $18,000 and $22,000 to do properly. The house on the sound side of Hatteras, with its small dock and its quarter-acre lot, would sell for approximately $380,000 in the current market, which would cover the mortgage and the back taxes and the closing costs, and leave approximately $240,000, which Sloane proposed to split evenly between them. Mara listened to all of it. She understood the math. She also understood sitting at her dead father's kitchen table, with his coffee mug still in the dish rack by the sink, that Sloane was not asking her permission. Sloane was telling her what was going to happen. And Sloane was not wrong. The math required it. The house was going to be sold. She said, "Where am I going to live, Sloane?" Sloane said, "You can stay with me in Raleigh until you figure something out." Mara looked at the coffee mug in the dish rack. It was a plain white mug from a hardware store in Nag's Head. Derry had used it every morning for at least 15 years. There was a ring of permanent discoloration inside the rim that no amount of washing had ever fully removed. She said okay. She did not mean it about Raleigh. She meant okay to the rest of it, to the math, to the fact that the house was going to be sold, and the boat was going to be sold, and the 4th generation of Callaways on Hatteras Island was going to end, financially speaking, with a wire transfer. She meant okay in the way you say okay when something is true, and you are not ready to say so, but you are not going to argue with the truth either. Then Sloane put a second envelope on the table. She said, "I found this in his desk. I don't know what you want to do with it, but you should know it exists." Mara opened the envelope. Inside was a contract. A real estate purchase offer dated May 2014 on the letterhead of a company called Harwick Coastal Development, LLC, with addresses in Charlotte and in Washington, D.C. The offer was for the house, the dock, and the adjacent waterfront lot. The offered price was $1,200,000. On the signature page, where the seller's signature was indicated, Derry Calloway had written nothing. He had simply drawn a single line through the signature block and written in his careful, compressed handwriting, "Not for any price. DC." Mara stared at the paper. Sloan said the property is worth maybe a third of that now, in terms of what we'd actually get after the mortgage and costs. He turned down $1.2 million to stay in a house he couldn't afford to insure. Mara did not say anything. Sloan said, "I'm not saying he was wrong. I'm saying I don't understand it." Mara turned the contract over in her hands and looked at the letterhead again. Harwick Coastal Development. She had the specific sensation of recognizing a name without knowing where, from the way you recognize a face on the street and cannot place it until 3 hours later it comes to you suddenly while you are doing something else entirely. She set the contract down. She did not say anything. She filed the name in the part of her mind where she kept things that were not yet finished. The house sold in February. The Miss Agnes sold in March to Tolliver from Virginia Beach, who promised to keep the name and whose handshake told her he meant it. Mara moved into the rented room above the fish house on the day the cottage sale closed, carrying 2 bags and her father's canvas sea bag with his personal effects inside his ball cap, his folding knife, his tide tables going back 12 years, the brass ship's clock from the Miss Agnes bulkhead still running, still keeping time. She took a job mending nets at the fish house for $14 an hour. She deposited the wire transfer of $120,000 into her checking account and did not touch it. Then came the night that changed the direction of everything. It was a warm evening in late May. Mara sat on the dock behind the fish house with her father's sea bag beside her and her laptop open on her knees, looking without real purpose at listings on the Dare County Public Surplus property page. It was the kind of looking you do when you are not quite ready to stop working, but your mind has run ahead of the task and gone somewhere you cannot yet follow. The listing was near the bottom of the page. Abandoned U.S. life-saving station, Barrier Island, 9 miles north of Hatteras. Accessible by boat or sand. Road floods at high tide. Built 1911 by U.S. Life Saving Service. Transferred to U.S. CG 1915. Decommissioned 1958. Vacant since. Dare County Historic Commission relinquished interest 2014. Asking price $10. There was one photograph, a weathered shingle-sided building on a low dune above the Atlantic, a square signal tower rising from the center of the roof, a wide covered porch facing the ocean, a row of small windows on the second floor. The shingles had gone silver with the salt. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she closed the laptop and sat in the dark with the sound of the harbor water against the fish house pilings and her father's sea bag between her feet. The brass clock in the bag ticked with the same patient authority it had kept for 43 years. She went upstairs and slept. In the morning, she found the notebook. She had been going through the sea bag more carefully than usual, looking for a particular document she needed for the estate paperwork, and at the bottom of the bag, under the tide tables, she found a small spiral-bound notebook she had not noticed before. It was the kind Derry had used for years to record his fishing spots. Latitude and longitude in his compressed handwriting, depth soundings dates, weather conditions, notes about current patterns, and bottom structure. She had seen him writing in notebooks like this her entire life. She had assumed the ones in the sea bag were the same. She opened it. It was different. The first 30 pages were fish spots, yes. Familiar. The handwriting she had known since childhood, the terse, numerical language of a working fisherman. But near the back of the notebook, beginning approximately 6 months before Derry's death, the entries changed. They were no longer coordinates and depths. They were notes. observations, things he had been thinking about. Most of them she did not fully understand. References to people she did not know, to conversations she had not been part of, to decisions he had been turning over. But on the second to last page of the notebook, there was a single entry in Derry's handwriting. No date, just a set of GPS coordinates, and below the coordinates, a name. She recognized the life-saving station on the barrier island, the one from the $10 listing, and below the name in the same compressed hand, but written more deliberately than the rest, circled twice with a red pen, Mara. She read it 3 times. She sat at the small table in the rented room above the fish house, with the notebook open in front of her, and the brass clock ticking on the shelf, and the morning harbor sounds coming through the window, and she understood that her father had known about the station, had been thinking about it, had written her name next to it. He had not told her, but he had written her name. She called the Dare County Clerk's office in Manteo at 8 o'clock that morning. The woman who answered was named Mrs. Pruitt, no relation to Agnes, or possibly a very distant one, the way everyone on the Outer Banks is a very distant relation of everyone else. Mrs. Pruitt confirmed the listing was still active. Mrs. Pruitt confirmed the asking price was $10. Mrs. Pruitt said she would need to come into the office with proof of identity and a certified check or money order for $10, and the property would be hers. Mara asked if there was anything else she needed to know about the property. Mrs. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Then she said just that it's been sitting there since 1958, and whatever's in it has been sitting there just as long, and if you're the kind of person who knows what to do with a thing like that, then you're probably the right person to have it. Mara drove to Manteo that afternoon with her last $10 bill in her wallet and her father's notebook on the passenger seat. She signed the deed. She took the iron key. She drove back to Hatteras in the early evening with the deed folded in the front pocket of her jacket, and she sat on the dock behind the fish house with the sound of the harbor around her. And she held the iron key in both hands, and it was cold and heavy, and it had been waiting in a county records office for 65 years for someone to come for it. She did not sleep much that night. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from a law firm in Charlotte. The letter was addressed to the estate of Derry Calloway, care of Sloane Calloway in Raleigh, and Sloane forwarded it to Mara with a sticky note attached. Do you know what this is? Mara opened the letter. It was from Harwick Coastal Development. It was addressed to the estate and to any heirs, and it expressed in the careful language of lawyers who are paid to be indirect about direct things. A strong continued interest in acquiring waterfront property along the Hatteras Island corridor and the adjacent barrier island chain, and a willingness to discuss terms that would reflect the current market and the specific value of any historic structures in the area. The specific value of any historic structures in the area. Mara read the phrase twice. She set the letter on the table beside Derry's notebook. She looked at them both for a moment, the lawyer's careful language and her father's compressed handwriting, both pointing at the same piece of land from opposite directions. She put the letter in the folder where she kept the paperwork. She did not call the law firm. She did not call Sloane. She called Burl Ackerman in Rodanthe, who was 71 years old and had spent 20 years maintaining the brickwork of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, and she asked him if he had time to teach her what she needed to know about restoring an old wooden structure on a barrier island. Burl said he had plenty of time. Burl said, "Come on Saturday and bring work gloves." She went on Saturday. She brought work gloves. She was 22 years old. She had no boat and no home and no plan beyond what her father had written in a notebook at the bottom of a canvas sea bag. And she was standing at the beginning of something she could not yet name on a barrier island, where the ocean was on one side and the sound was on the other, and the sky was the whole ceiling, and The people who stayed through the storms were the ones the island kept. Her father had known about the station. He had written her name next to it. He had not explained. He never explained. He taught you things by pointing at them and trusting that you were paying attention. She was paying attention. She had always been paying attention. What the storm berries. The skiff was a 14-foot aluminum Lund that Mara had borrowed from Burl Ackerman on the understanding that she would return it with a full tank and without any new dents, the second condition being the one Burl cared about more. She had loaded it the night before, with tools wrapped in canvas tarps, a cooler with 3 days of food, 2 5-gallon jugs of fresh water, and her father's sea bag wedged under the bow seat where it would stay dry. She pushed off from the Hatteras public ramp at 5:40 in the morning before the sun was fully up with the sound flat and gray around her and the mainland invisible in the haze to the west. The crossing took 40 minutes. Pamlico Sound. In June, on a calm morning, with the wind out of the southwest at 8 knots, is the color of old pewter. It is shallow, rarely more than 15 feet, and in many places considerably less. And the bottom is sand and seagrass. And the occasional oyster bar that will find the hull of an aluminum skiff if you are not reading the water correctly. Mara read it correctly. She had been reading this sound since she was 6 years old. She ran the skiff at 3/4 throttle on a compass bearing her father had written in the notebook, beside the station's coordinates, and she did not hit anything. The island emerged from the haze, gradually, the way barrier islands do, first as a low dark line, that might be cloud shadow, then as something more solid, and then as the specific silver-gray profile of the station against the pale sky. The shingle siding weathered to the color of driftwood. The square tower rising from the center of the roof. The wide covered porch facing the ocean side. The boat ramp descended from the sound side of the station to the water at a shallow angle, the concrete cracked and grass grown, but still serviceable. Mara ran the skiff up onto the ramp and cut the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. The Atlantic was audible on the other side of the station, a low, continuous sound that was not quite a roar and not quite a murmur, but something between the two. The sound of the ocean going about its permanent business, regardless of who was on the beach. A pair of oyster catchers moved along the sound shore ahead of her, picking at the exposed mudflat with their bright orange bills. A brown pelican crossed overhead without looking down. Mara climbed out of the skiff, tied the bowline to the iron ring set into the side of the ramp, and stood looking at the station. Up close, it was worse than the photograph had suggested, and the photograph had not suggested anything good. The south face of the building, which took the full weight of the ocean weather, had shingles missing in long diagonal strips, where the wind had peeled them back over successive storm seasons. The covered porch on the ocean side had lost 2 of its support posts, and the porch roof sagged at the east end in a way that would not survive another hurricane season without intervention. Several of the second floor windows had lost their glazing and been covered from the inside with plywood that had darkened and swelled with moisture. The concrete boat ramp was grass grown and cracked but structurally present. The signal tower was intact from the base to the top, where the lantern housing had been taken off by the hurricane of 1996 and never replaced, leaving the brass lamp mount exposed to the weather on its bolts. The iron key turned in the front door lock with the heaviness of a mechanism that had not been asked to work in many years. The door opened inward with the low groan of a wooden structure, settling its protest about being disturbed. Mara stepped inside. The ground floor was a single large room, the original crew quarters and mess hall of the life-saving station, with wide plank floors of heart pine that had darkened to amber over 112 years. And a brick fireplace at the south end, and a heavy wooden table in the center of the room that was still there, as if waiting, as if whoever had set it there in 1911 had meant for it to stay. The beadboard walls had been painted Coast Guard white sometime in the 1940s, and the paint had yellowed and cracked, and in several places peeled back entirely to the raw wood beneath. There were hooks on the wall beside the door where the surfmen had hung their oilskins. Some of the hooks still had things hanging on them: a length of frayed rope, a rusted lantern, a canvas strap whose original purpose Mara could not determine. A narrow staircase rose from the north end of the room to the second floor, and from the second floor, a ship's ladder climbed through a hatch to the signal room at the top of the tower. Mara walked to the ground floor first. She checked the fireplace for structural integrity. The mortar was soft in places, but the firebox was sound. She checked the plank floor for rot. There was a soft section near the east wall, roughly 4 feet square, that would need sistering or replacement. She checked the ceiling joists by pressing her palm flat against the beadboard overhead and pushing solid. She checked each exterior wall by pressing her knuckle against the sheathing and listening for the hollow sound of rot behind the surface. The south wall had it in 2 places near the lower corner and running up about 18 inches. The other walls were acceptable. She climbed to the second floor. 2 rooms each with a window on the ocean side and a window on the sound side. The floor was sound. The windows that still had glass were intact. The room smelled of salt and thyme and the specific emptiness of spaces that have not been breathed in for decades. She climbed the ship's ladder to the signal room. It was 8 feet square, windows on all 4 sides looking out over the Atlantic to the east, the Sound to the west, the barrier island running north and south in both directions. From up here, you could see everything that mattered: the horizon, the inlet, the mainland, haze, the movement of weather coming across the water. This was why they had built towers on barrier islands for 150 years, not for the romance of it, because the ocean did not announce what it was going to do, and someone needed to be high enough to see it coming. The brass lamp mount was still bolted to the ceiling. The signal flag locker stood against the east wall, bolted to the wall studs with heavy iron brackets, exactly as tall and narrow and iron gray as Mara had imagined it from the county listing description. The locker's door was sealed with rust. She stood in the signal room for a while without touching anything. Just stood and looked out at the Atlantic and listened to the sound of the water below, and felt for the first time since November something that was not quite grief and not quite purpose, but was in the direction of purpose, moving toward it. The way weather moves, not according to what you want, but according to what the conditions require. She went back down and started measuring. The first 3 months were the education. Burl Ackerman had given her a list. Not a long list. Burl was a man of compressed communication in the tradition of all the skilled tradesmen Mara had known on the Outer Banks, but a specific one. Repoint the south chimney. Before you do anything else, it will fall in the first bad storm if you don't. Sister, the rot in the east wall. Before you touch the porch is cosmetic. The rot is structural. Get the roof tight before you start on the interior, or you will redo everything twice. Mara followed the list. She mixed Portland mortar in a 5-gallon bucket, according to Burl's formula, and repointed the chimney herself over 11 days in July, working from a wooden scaffold she built against the south wall, using lumber she ferried over in the skiff from a salvage yard in Engelhard. Burl had taught her the scaffold geometry on a Saturday morning in his driveway in Rodenthe, using scrap 2x4s to demonstrate the diagonal bracing that made the difference between a scaffold that held and one that didn't, and Mara had built the scaffold on the island alone, and it had held. The chimney work was slow and meticulous and lonely in the way that all good masonry work is lonely, which is to say that it required a quality of focused attention that left no room for the mind to wander. And the focused attention was itself a kind of relief from the other kind of thinking, the kind that happened in the evenings when the tools were down and the sound was going dark, and the station settled around her with its 112-year-old patience. She slept in the station from the beginning, a sleeping bag on the old crew quarters floor with the brick fireplace and the heavy table and the hooks for the oilskins that weren't there anymore. She cooked on a propane camp stove she had carried over in the skiff. She washed from a bucket. She kept the brass clock from her father's sea bag on the heavy table, and it ticked through the nights while the Atlantic worked on the beach below. On clear evenings, she sat on the oceanside porch, the sagging east end propped temporarily on a stack of salvaged bricks, and watched the light change over the water. The sun went down behind her, behind the Sound and the mainland, and the sky above the Atlantic went through the colors in sequence, the yellow and the orange and the rose and the specific deep blue-black that her father had called keeper blue because he said it was the color the old lighthouse keepers had watched for from their towers across 100 years of standing watch on the barrier islands. She watched it every evening. She did not know yet what she was keeping watch for. She watched anyway. She was spending money carefully. The net mending job at the Hatteras Fish House covered her rent for the room she was no longer using. She had arranged with the fish house owner, a man named Grover Whaley, who had known her father for 30 years, to work remotely mending nets delivered to the island by skiff twice a week, and picked up the same way the finished work bundled in the bow of the return trip. It was an arrangement that should not have been practical, and was practical only because Grover Whaley was a man who solved problems the way fishing men solve problems, which is to say, by finding the configuration that works and not overthinking how it looks. She did not touch the $120,000. She did not touch the $10 worth of lumber either, which is to say, she did not touch anything that wasn't being paid for by the network, because the 120,000 was the Callaway's money, and she was holding it in trust, and she did not yet know for what. By August, she had the chimney repointed, and the east wall wrought addressed, sistered with new lumber, and sheathed with cedar. She had split herself from a pile of salvaged logs, and the roof patched with enough detail to see another season. The south porch was still sagging. She would get to the south porch. The south porch could wait. What she had not yet gone back to was the signal room. She had been up there twice since that first morning, both times to check the tower structure and assess the lantern housing damage. She had not touched the flag locker. She was aware of not touching the flag locker in the specific way. You are aware of a door you are not ready to open, not avoiding it exactly, but not approaching it either. Circling at a respectful distance until you understand what is on the other side. It was a Thursday in late September when she finally opened the south wall. The rot she had found in the exterior sheathing of the south tower face was worse than she had thought. When she pulled the damaged sheathing away, she found it had extended inward past the building paper into the framing cavity and had compromised the lower section of one of the wall studs. Not critically, not immediately dangerous, but enough that it needed to be addressed before she closed the wall back up, which meant opening the interior sheathing on the other side to access the full length of the affected stud. She pulled the interior beadboard panels, carefully working a flat bar along each nail line, trying to preserve the boards for reuse. The beadboard was original, installed in 1911, the same year Cormac Callaway had been working on this building, and she was not going to replace it with new material if she could help it. She got 4 panels off before she saw it. The main structural beam, the doubled 2x10 that ran horizontally through the tower wall, framing at the 8-foot height, transferring the load of the roof above to the corner posts, had its interface exposed when she removed the 4th panel. The wood was old growth longleaf pine, dense and dark and hard as iron, the kind of timber that had not been cut commercially for 100 years, because there was none left to cut. Cut into the face of the beam in clean carpenter's chisel work were 3 lines of text. Cormac Calloway, 1911, Pemaquid, Maine. She put her hand on it. The wood was smooth where it had been cut smoother than the surrounding surface. The tool marks still clean after 112 years in the dark inside the wall. Her great-great-grandfather's name. The year he had put it there. The place he had come from, the place he had already left for good. By the time he carved it, but which he had carried with him the way you carry the place that made you even after you have made yourself into something new. He had built this tower. He had put his hands on every piece of it. He had been 22 years old, exactly Mara's age now, and he had worked through a frozen winter to raise these walls. And on the last day before he closed the wall up, he had taken a chisel and cut his name into the wood that would hold the building up. Not for anyone else to see. The beadboard went right over it. No one had seen it until now. For himself. Because the work had cost him something, and he needed to mark it. Mara stood with her hand on the beam for a long time. She could hear the Atlantic on the other side of the building. She could hear the wind finding the gaps in the sheathing she had not yet repaired moving through the building, with the particular whistle of salt air through old wood. She thought about Cormac coming to this island in 1908 with $40 and a set of tools. She thought about him building the very structure she was now repairing, working in cold that froze the mortar in the buckets. She thought about him carving his name into the wood before he closed the wall. A 22-year-old man from Maine on a barrier island 300 miles from home, putting his name in a place where only the building would know it. She thought about her father's notebook, the GPS coordinates, and the circled name. The Callaways had been here before she arrived. They had been here before any of them knew they would be here. The station had been waiting for her the way the beam had been waiting with its name already in it, sealed up inside the walls, patient as timber, patient as salt. She left the beam exposed. She would close the wall around it, repair the damaged stud, replace the beadboard. But she was going to leave a small panel removable, secured with screws rather than nails, so that the name in the beam could be accessed without damage, so that it could be seen again when the right moment came for seeing it. She went upstairs and got the pry bar from the toolbox. The flag locker opened on the 3rd attempt. The rust had sealed the door completely along the upper hinge, and Mara had to work the flat bar into the gap at the top corner and lever steadily, not sharply the way Burl had taught her, to work corroded hardware pressure, not force time, not strength. On the 3rd attempt, the hinge broke free with a sound like a muffled shot, and the door swung open 6 inches, and then stopped, the bottom hinge still holding, and Mara put both hands on the edge of the door and pulled steadily until the bottom hinge gave as well, and the door opened fully. Inside the locker, 12 signal flags on brass clips, moth-eaten and faded to pastels that bore only a general relation to their original colors. The clips were labeled A through L. The flags for M through Z were absent, removed at some point before the station closed, transferred somewhere, or simply lost to the decades. Below the flags, a row of empty hooks where additional flags or equipment had once hung. And at the back of the locker, the iron back panel was not flush with the wall. There was a gap roughly 3 inches between the iron and the beadboard behind it. Mara reached her hand into the gap, past the lowest row of hooks, feeling along the wall surface behind the locker. Her fingers found the edge of a wooden shelf, maybe 8 inches wide, mounted directly to the wall, studs behind the locker. The shelf was invisible from the front of the locker. You could not see it. You could only find it by reaching in and knowing to look. On the shelf were 3 objects: a logbook bound in heavy brown leather with a brass clasp, the leather darkened and stiff but intact; a canvas pouch, the drawstring still tied heavy with the specific weight and sound of coin; a folded letter on thick cream paper, the fold sealed with a small, irregular blob of what appeared to be tar. She carried all 3 down the ship's ladder, down the staircase, and set them on the heavy wooden table in the old crew quarters in the morning light coming through the oceanside windows. She sat down on the bench. She put her hands flat on the table on either side of the 3 objects and breathed. Then she opened the logbook. Every entry from June 14th, 1911, the station's first operational day, through September 30th, 1958. 47 years. 6 keepers had kept this record. The handwriting changed 6 times as authority passed from one man to the next. Each keeper's hand distinct, the first keeper's script flowing and formal, the second keeper's cramped and precise, the subsequent hands ranging from workmanlike to nearly calligraphic. Every rescue was recorded. Every patrol. Every storm watch. Every vessel assisted or recovered or lost within sight of the station. She turned to the last entry. Station decommissioned this date per U.S.C.G. District 5 Order 58-447. Final watch stood by Keeper H.R. Voss, 0600 to 1800. No vessels in distress. Sea State 2. Wind northeast at 8 knots. Clear. Visibility unlimited. This station has preserved the lives of 341 persons across 47 years of continuous operation. The men who kept watch here deserve to be remembered. I am the last of them, Harlan Reed Voss, Boatswain's Mate, Chief United States Coast Guard, September 30th, 1958. She opened the canvas pouch. 28 Liberty Double Eagles. Gold coins, each one the size of a silver dollar. Each one bearing the standing figure of Liberty on the obverse and the eagle on the reverse. Each one dated between 1907 and 1932. She would learn later, when she finally drove to a coin dealer in Manteo, that 28 pre-1933 Liberty Double Eagles in the condition of these, protected from light and handling for 65 years, in a canvas pouch in an iron locker on an island, were worth approximately $61,000. She opened the letter. The tar seal cracked cleanly in one piece, as though it had been waiting to be opened and was only observing the formality. The letter was 2 pages in a hand she did not recognize. She read it. To whoever finds this shelf, my name is Harlan Voss. I have served as keeper of this station since June of 1941, when I was assigned here by District 5 at the age of 34, following 3 years of sea duty. I am now 51 years old, and tomorrow I will close the station and report to a desk assignment in Elizabeth City that I have requested not to receive and have been assigned regardless. I have kept this station through 17 years. That included the war, during which I and the men under my command patrolled this beach every night from 1942 through 1945, watching for German submarines, of which there were many in these waters in those years. We found evidence of them. We reported what we found. We kept walking. We also kept this station through the hurricane of 1944, which put 4 feet of water through the ground floor and took the roof off the boathouse, and the hurricane of 1954, which did more structural damage than the one in 1944, And we repaired what needed repairing both times and kept the watch. In 17 years at this station, I have participated in the rescue of 219 persons. The station's total across all keepers is 341. I do not take particular pride in my own portion of that number because the rescues were not about me. They were about being awake when someone needed someone to be awake. The gold is my own. I have saved it across 17 years from my Coast Guard pay. I did not trust banks after what happened to my father's money in 1933, and I did not change my mind on that subject afterward. I hid the coins behind the signal flag locker because the locker is bolted to the wall with iron brackets, and a person who does not know this station intimately would not think to reach behind it. The logbook belongs to this station. I cannot bring myself to surrender it to the district records office in Elizabeth City, where it will be cataloged and filed and never read again. It belongs here where the watches were stood. I do not know who will find this shelf. It may be years. It may be decades. I hope it is a person who knows the water. I hope it is a person who has stood a watch of their own. I hope it is a person who understands that a life-saving station is not a building. A life-saving station is a promise that someone is paying attention. The gold is for whoever finds this to do with as they judge right. The logbook is for the station. Use both accordingly. Before I close, I want to record one name that I have not entered in the official log because it does not belong in an official log. His name was Cormac Calloway. He was not Coast Guard. He was a fisherman and builder who had lived on this island for 30 years by the time the war came. He was 53 years old in 1942. He had no military obligation and no official role. He came to the station in January of 1942, the week after the first German submarine attack on a merchant ship off Cape Hatteras, and he told me he intended to walk the beach patrol with my men at night. I told him it was not a civilian operation. He said he understood that. He said he intended to walk the beach anyway, and if I wanted to make it official, I could, and if I didn't, he would walk it unofficially. He walked it every night from January 1942 through August 1945. 3 years and 7 months. Every night, he asked for nothing. He accepted no pay. He was there when I arrived to relieve the night patrol, and he was there when the patrol went out, and in all that time, he never failed to show up, and he never asked for recognition of any kind. His name deserves to be written down somewhere that someone will read it. Cormac Calloway, volunteer. Age 53, every night. No exceptions. If you are a Calloway reading this, he did his watch. Now, do yours. Harlan Reed Voss, boatswain's mate. Chief, USCG, September 30th, 1958. Mara read the letter once. Then she read it again. Then she set it on the heavy wooden table and put both hands flat on the wood on either side of it. And she looked at the letter in the logbook and the canvas pouch with the gold coins. And she looked at the morning light coming through the oceanside windows and laying itself in long rectangles across the heart pine floor, and she cried. She cried for about 3 minutes alone in the old crew quarters, with the sound of the Atlantic below and the ticking of her father's brass clock on the table beside the letter. She cried for Harlan Voss, who had stood his watch for 17 years and written a letter to nobody and sealed it with tar and trusted the building to keep it. She cried for Cormac Calloway, who had been 53 years old and walked a cold beach every night for 3 years and 7 months, and asked for nothing, and whose name had almost not been written down at all. She cried for Derry, who had known about the station, and written her name next to it in a notebook at the bottom of a sea bag, and not said a word, because he did not explain things because he taught by pointing and trusting that you were paying attention. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand. She said aloud to the empty room and the brick fireplace and the morning light, "Thank you, Chief Voss. I'll keep the watch." She picked up the letter and read it a third time. The letter from Harwick Coastal Development arrived on the island the following week. Not directly, there was no mail delivery to a barrier island with no road access. It arrived at the post office box Mara had maintained in Hatteras Village, and she picked it up on her Thursday supply run when she crossed the Sound to restock food and pick up the network from Grover Whaley. She read it standing in the parking lot of the post office, with the skiff trailer behind the truck and the Sound visible at the end of the street. It was more direct than the first letter, the one addressed to the estate. This one was addressed to Mara Calloway, directly as registered owner of the Barrier Island Life Saving Station. It expressed in the manner of legal language that wants to sound like a courtesy and doesn't quite get there that Harwick Coastal Development maintained an active interest in acquiring the property and was prepared to offer a price considerably above assessed value. It noted that the property's status as a surplus transfer might raise questions about the validity of the original transaction under certain interpretations of federal property law. It invited Mara to contact the firm's legal representative to discuss the matter at her convenience. It invited her at her convenience. The last line of the letter was, "We hope to resolve this to everyone's satisfaction." Mara folded the letter and put it in the glove compartment of the truck. She stood in the parking lot for a moment, with the sound of the harbor behind her and the flag snapping on the post outside the post office, and the specific quality of coastal light in October, which has a sharpness to it that summer light doesn't, a clarity that makes edges visible that the heat haze of summer softens. Then she drove to Rodanthe to see Burl Ackerman. Burl was in his garage when she arrived, which was where Burl always was when the weather was decent, working on one of the 3 ongoing projects he always seemed to have in some state of near completion. Today, it was a wooden storm shutter he was refitting for a neighbor's house. He looked up when Mara pulled in and looked back down at the shutter. She gave him the letter. He read it standing, holding the letter, with the same careful attention he gave to architectural drawings, which was a kind of reading that looked for what was structural and what was decorative, and was not confused by which was which. He said they are not wrong about the federal property law question. That's a real argument. Not a winning one, but a real one. Mara said, "How do I stop it?" Burl set the letter on his workbench and looked at it. He was a quiet man in the tradition of men who have spent their careers doing work that has no tolerance for carelessness, and his quiet had a quality of precision to it. He did not speak until he knew what he meant to say. He said, "You need what was in those files when the county took possession of the property in 1958, the original transfer documents. Not the surplus, listing the original documents from when the Coast Guard handed it to Dare County. If there are deed restrictions in that original transfer, they supersede anything Harwick is trying to argue." He said County Records Office in Manteo. Historic property files. They go back to the 30s in the physical archive, and nobody has digitized most of it because nobody has had a reason to. He looked at her. He said, "You have a reason." She drove to Manteo the next morning. The Dare County Records Archive was in the basement of the county administration building, managed by a woman named Cecilia Pruitt, who was, it turned out, a second cousin once removed of Agnes Calloway née Pruitt from Ocracoke Island, which on the Outer Banks meant they were practically family. Cecilia Pruitt was 60 years old and had worked in the county records office for 31 years and knew the physical archive the way Mara knew the Sound, not from maps, but from direct acquaintance, from having put her hands on it repeatedly over a long period of time. Mara explained what she needed. Cecilia Pruitt put on her reading glasses, went into the archive, and came back 22 minutes later carrying a cardboard file box with a label that read USCG Property Transfers, Dare County, 1950 to 1965. They went through it together at the reading table. The transfer documents for the station were in the third folder. There was the official Coast Guard decommission order. There was the county acceptance form. There was the standard surplus property transfer agreement. And at the back of the folder, separate from the other documents, was a single page on Coast Guard letterhead dated September 29th, 1958. One day before Harlan Voss wrote his letter and sealed it behind the signal flag locker. The page bore Voss's signature and a Coast Guard notarial stamp and the signature of the Dare County clerk of the period. Cecilia Pruitt put her finger on it and said, "I have never seen this document before, and I have looked at this folder at least 3 times over the years." It was a deed restriction addendum. 3 paragraphs of precise legal language drafted Mara, with certain reading it not by a lawyer, but by a man who had read enough official documents in 17 years of government service to understand what legal language had to do, and had done it himself. The addendum stated that the transfer of the properties was conditional upon a covenant running with the land, binding on all future owners, regardless of how the property changed hands, requiring that the property be maintained for public maritime heritage and safety purposes. It stated that any conversion of the property to private commercial use would void the transfer, retroactively restoring title to Dare County. It stated that the covenant could not be waived or modified without a unanimous vote of the Dare County Board of Commissioners at a properly noticed public meeting. The addendum had been properly executed and notarized. It had been filed with the deed. It had never been digitized. It had sat in this folder in this archive for 65 years. Mara read it twice. Then she looked at Cecilia Pruitt. Cecilia Pruitt looked back at her over the reading glasses. Cecilia said carefully, "This is a legally binding deed restriction of record. It has been in the chain of title since 1958. Anyone conducting proper due diligence on this property before filing a legal challenge to your ownership would have been required to find it." She paused. She said, "Which means either Harwick's lawyers found it and chose not to mention it to you, or they did not find it because they did not look hard enough. Neither interpretation is favorable to Harwick." Mara said, "Can I get a certified copy of this?" Cecilia Pruitt was already walking to the copier. Sloane arrived on the island on a Saturday morning in October, 11 days after Mara had found the deed restriction. She did not announce herself. Mara heard the outboard first, not the skiff's familiar Evinrude, but something heavier, a rental motor, and she came around the south side of the station to find her sister tying a rented aluminum boat to the iron ring on the boat ramp with the careful knot of a person who has been paying attention to how knots are tied and is doing her best with recently acquired information. Sloane stood up and looked at Mara and said, "I quit the Harwick contract." Mara said when Sloane said 10 days ago, when I understood what they were actually planning to do with this stretch of coast. She reached into the bag over her shoulder and took out a folder, the kind that real estate professionals use to organize documents heavy cardstock, with the firm's logo that had been crossed out with a black marker. Inside the folder was a stack of documents. Internal Harwick planning materials. Acquisition lists, environmental impact, filings, communications with the North Carolina Department of Transportation about road access permits. She handed it to Mara. Mara leafed through it. Harwick had been assembling a contiguous coastal acquisition for 7 years. The Barrier Island Station was the last significant piece. Without it, the northern anchor of their planned resort development did not have the ocean frontage the project required. The station was not incidental to their plan. It was load-bearing. Mara looked up at Sloane. Sloane said Dad knew what they were building. He understood it years before I did, and I work in this industry. She said it without bitterness. She said it the way you say something true when you have had enough time to stop being defensive about it. She said he turned down $1.2 million because he understood that if he sold, they'd eventually have everything they needed. He was the one piece they couldn't get without his consent. And he knew it. Mara thought about the line on the back of the contract. Not for any price. DC. She thought about the notebook in the sea bag, the circled name. She said he couldn't stop them permanently, just slow them down. Sloane said he slowed them down long enough. Then she looked at the folder in Mara's hands and at the station behind her. She said, "What do you have?" Mara told her about the deed restriction. Sloane was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that she had not said to her sister in a very long time, if she had ever said it at all in precisely this way. She said, "Tell me what you need." The two of them sat on the oceanside porch in the October light, the sagging east end now properly supported on new posts Mara had installed in September, and Mara laid out the documents, the Harwick letter, the deed restriction, the certified copy from Cecilia Pruitt's office, and Sloane read them with the focused attention of a person who understands what documents can and cannot do and is calculating the distance between the two. The Atlantic worked on the beach below them. The oyster catchers were back on the sound shore, or different oyster catchers that looked the same, which on a barrier island amounts to the same thing. The brass clock ticked on the heavy table inside. Sloane said this restriction is airtight if it's properly recorded, which it is. Their lawyers should have found it. If they found it and sent you that letter anyway, they were hoping you didn't know it existed. Mara said, "I didn't know it existed until 11 days ago." Sloane looked at her. Then she looked out at the water. She said Chief Voss wrote that restriction the day before he wrote his letter. He planned both of them. He put the restriction in the official record and the explanation behind the locker, and he trusted that whoever came along would find both. Mara said he built it the same way Cormac built the tower, to hold. They sat for a while without speaking. The light moved across the water the way October light does on the Outer Banks horizontal in particular, and full of a quality that summer doesn't have a willingness to show you what things actually look like. Then Sloane said, "I'm going to need a place to work while we sort this out." She said it matter-of-factly the way she said most things. Then she said, "I can work remotely. I've been meaning to for a while." Mara looked at her sister. She said the second floor has 2 rooms. Sloane said, "I noticed." The distance between them was not gone. It was not the distance it had been in February when Sloane had sat at the kitchen table and opened a folder and told Mara what was going to happen. It was moving the way a tide moves, not because anyone decides it should, but because the water has its own schedule and the water does not consult the people on the shore. The Atlantic was the color of old pewter in the late afternoon. The signal tower rose above them with its missing lantern housing the brass lamp mount exposed to the sky at the top, still bolted to the ceiling after 67 years of weather waiting. What the light keeps. The letter from Harwick's legal team arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, 12 days after Sloane had tied her rented boat to the iron ring on the boat ramp and said, "Tell me what you need." It was not this time an invitation. It was a formal notice of legal challenge to the validity of the property transfer filed with the Dare County Superior Court under a statute governing surplus government property dispositions, arguing that a $10 consideration was insufficient to constitute a valid conveyance of real property with an assessed value in excess of $400,000, and that the transfer should therefore be voided and the property returned to county ownership for proper disposal through competitive bidding. They were not trying to buy the station. They were trying to put it back on the market so they could buy it properly at a price that would exclude Mara entirely. Sloan read the filing at the heavy table in the old crew quarters with a cup of coffee and the expression of a person encountering a chess move they have already thought past. She said they found the deed restriction. Mara said, "How do you know?" Sloan said, "Because they didn't challenge the deed restriction. They went around it. If they challenge the transfer, the deed restriction goes with it. The whole transaction unwinds and the property reverts to the county without the 1958 covenant attached, because technically it would be as if the 1958 transfer never fully completed. Then the county reoffers the property and Harwick bids at market rate, and there's no covenant to stop them from doing whatever they want with it." She set the filing down. She said, "It's actually a smart argument." Mara said, "Can they win it?" Sloan was quiet for a moment. She looked at the certified copy of the deed restriction that had been sitting on the corner of the table for 2 weeks. Then she looked at the letter from Harwick. Then she looked at the window and the sound and the mainland haze beyond it. She said, "Not if we find the right lawyer, and not if we make this public before they can make it boring." The right lawyer turned out to be a woman named Portia Greer, who had grown up on Roanoke Island, had gone to law school at UNC Chapel Hill, had spent 8 years at a firm in Raleigh, doing exactly the kind of commercial real estate litigation that Harwick's lawyers specialized in, and had come back to the Outer Banks 3 years ago to open a 2-person practice in Manteo that handled, among other things, historic preservation cases and coastal property disputes. Sloan found her. Sloan had the instinct trained by years in commercial real estate for identifying which person in a room actually understood the architecture of a problem, and when she called around the Outer Banks legal community looking for someone who knew both historic property law and the specific procedural landscape of Dare County Superior Court. Portia Greer's name came up twice in the first hour. Portia Greer drove out to the island on a Friday morning in a skiff she owned herself, which told Mara something important before the woman said a word. She was 41 years old, compact and direct, with the quality of attention that Mara associated with people who had learned their trade in conditions that punished imprecision. She walked the station, read the deed restriction, read the Harwick filings, and sat at the heavy table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug for 3 minutes without speaking. Then she said Harwick's argument has one genuine weakness and several manufactured ones. The genuine weakness is that the $10 consideration, while nominal, is legally sufficient in North Carolina for a valid property transfer when the transaction is a government surplus disposition. The state has case law on this going back to 1987. Their argument isn't wrong exactly, it's just not as strong as they're presenting it. She said the manufactured weaknesses are the ones we use. She spread the documents on the table and pointed to the deed restriction. She said Voss recorded this restriction one day before the station was formally transferred. Under the recording statutes in effect in 1958, that sequence means the restriction attached to the property before the transfer completed, which means it is part of the original title, not an add-on. When Dare County accepted the transfer, they accepted it subject to this covenant. When the county listed the property as surplus in 2014, they were legally required to disclose the covenant in the listing. They didn't. That's a county procedural error, not a flaw in Mara's title. She looked at Mara. She said Harwick is arguing that the transfer was invalid because of the price. But the county's failure to disclose the covenant in the surplus listing creates a separate claim that actually strengthens your position. It means the property was not properly listed for surplus disposal to begin with, which means the only valid disposition is the one that actually happened, which is your $10 purchase. She paused. She said it's elegant, actually. Voss built the legal structure the same way he built the deed restriction to hold against pressure. The restriction makes the property essentially unusable for commercial development. The recording sequence makes the restriction unremovable. The county's procedural failure in the surplus listing becomes your shield rather than their weapon. She picked up her coffee. She said, I can win this. It will take 4 to 6 months, and it will cost money. Mara said, how much money? Portia Greer named a number. It was less than half what Mara had in the checking account. It was the first time Mara had thought about the $120,000 without the feeling that spending it would be a betrayal of something. She looked at the heavy table. She looked at the door and the hooks for the oilskins. She looked at the window with the October light coming through it, and the sound visible beyond the glass, the same sound Cormac Calloway had crossed in a workboat in 1910 to build this tower. The same sound Harlan Voss had watched from this building for 17 years. She said, do it. Portia filed the response to Harwick's challenge in the 3rd week of November, and it was, by the account of everyone who read it, a document that understood exactly what it was doing. It did not argue that the $10 price was adequate in any market sense. It argued that market adequacy was irrelevant to a government surplus disposition under North Carolina statute, cited 4 cases, and moved on. It introduced the deed restriction and its recording sequence in the 2nd section, documented the county's failure to disclose the covenant in the surplus listing. In the 3rd and in the 4th section, attached as an exhibit, a letter from the Dare County Historic Preservation Commission affirming that the property met the criteria for designation as a county historic landmark, a designation that Portia had moved simultaneously to secure. The historic landmark application had been Sloane's idea. She had been working at the heavy table for 2 weeks by then, her laptop open beside Mara's surveying notes, and Portia's preliminary filings driving her Raleigh clients remotely from the 2nd floor of an abandoned life-saving station on a barrier island with no road access. She was, Mara observed, entirely competent at this. She had adapted to the island's rhythms with the specific efficiency of a person who is actually underneath the Raleigh life and the SUV, and the commission structure still a Callaway from Hatteras, and who finds, when she stops moving fast enough to remember it, that the water makes sense to her in a way the city never entirely had. The historic landmark application required documentation of the property's historical significance. Sloane assembled it with the methodical thoroughness she brought to all documentation. The construction records from 1911, the Coast Guard operational history, the list of 341 rescues from the logbook, the deed restriction and its 1958 provenance, and a 2-page narrative she wrote herself about Cormac Calloway and Harlan Voss, and the 47 years of continuous watch that this station had kept over the water. She showed the narrative to Mara before she submitted it. Mara read it standing at the table. She read it twice. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, you wrote about Cormac. Sloane said he deserves to be in the official record. Voss wanted him in the record. The landmark application is a record. Mara looked at her sister. She said Dad would have liked this. Sloane said Dad would have said it was too many words and not enough action. But he would have liked it. The Dare County Historic Preservation Commission approved the landmark designation in January, 4 months after Mara had filed the original deed transfer. The designation was not legally dispositive of the court challenge. The case was still working its way through the Superior Court docket, but it changed the character of the dispute in a way that Portia had calculated carefully. A private development company challenging a private citizen's ownership of a county historic landmark in a coastal preservation case was a different story than a company challenging a nominal property transaction on technical grounds, and the Outer Banks Sentinel ran the story on the front page of its Thursday edition with a photograph of Mara standing on the station's porch. The photograph was taken by a retired Coast Guard petty officer from Elizabeth City named Darnell, who had driven down specifically because he had read about the case online and wanted to see the station. He was 64 years old and had served 22 years in the Coast Guard. And, had he told Mara, been to the station once as a young seaman in the 1980s on a buoy tender that had anchored off the island overnight. And he had gone ashore and walked around the outside of the building and had never forgotten it. He stayed for 3 hours. He walked every room. He stood in the signal room for a long time, looking out at the Atlantic the way people stood in that room quietly, with the specific quality of attention that the view required. 4 walls of window, and the ocean on one side, and the sound on the other, and the island running north and south below you, like a thin line someone had drawn between 2 kinds of water. Before he left, he told Mara that his grandfather had served at a life-saving station on the Virginia coast in the 1930s as a surfman. He said these men don't get remembered the way they should. What you're doing here matters. Mara said someone kept the logbook. That's why we know their names. He nodded. He got in his skiff and crossed the sound, and she watched him until the boat was small and then gone. In February, 6 months after Portia had filed the original response, the Dare County Superior Court issued its ruling. It was a 14-page opinion, and Portia called Mara from the courthouse steps in Manteo before the ink was fully dry on the printed copy to read her the conclusion. The court found that the transfer of the property to Mara Calloway was valid under North Carolina surplus property disposition statutes. The court found that the 1958 deed restriction was properly recorded, properly constituted, and ran with the land in perpetuity. The court found that Dare County's failure to disclose the deed restriction in the 2014 surplus listing constituted a procedural deficiency in the listing process, not a deficiency in Mara's title. The court found that Harwick Coastal Development's challenge was without merit. At the bottom of the opinion, in a passage that was technically dicta, meaning the judge had said it because she wanted to say it, rather than because it was necessary. To the legal conclusion, the judge wrote the covenant recorded by Boatswain's Mate, Chief Harlan Voss, on September 29th, 1958, reflects a clarity of purpose that does credit to its author. The property it protects is exactly the kind of property it was written to protect. The court declines to disturb it. Portia said over the phone the judge liked Voss. Mara was standing on the boat ramp when Portia called in the February cold, with the sound gray around her and the mainland invisible in the morning haze. She listened to the ruling. She did not say much. When Portia finished, she said thank you and meant it completely. She stood on the ramp for a while after. The oyster catchers were back on the Sound shore, or still there. She was no longer certain they ever fully left. The station stood behind her, its shingles still silver with salt. But the south chimney repointed the east wall, resheeted the porch posts new and true. The second floor windows reglazed the boat ramp, cleared of grass and debris. The signal tower rose from the center of the roof, with its missing lantern housing the gap at the top where the housing had been opened to the February sky, like a question that had not yet been answered. She went inside and told Sloane. Sloane was at the heavy table with her laptop and a coffee mug. She listened to the ruling and was quiet for a moment. Then she closed the laptop. She said, "I'm going to call Raleigh and tell them I'm working remote permanently." Mara said the second floor has 2 rooms. Sloane said, "I know. I've been in both of them." The lantern housing came from a maritime salvage dealer in Beaufort, who had acquired it from the decommissioning of a station on the Pamlico River, a housing of the correct period, 1920s construction. Heavy cast iron with the original Fresnel. Lens mount intact. The glass panels replaced at some point in the 1950s, but the iron frame original. It was not the housing that Harwick's 1996 hurricane had taken off this tower. It was close enough to be correct. It was correct enough to be right. Getting it to the island required 2 trips, with the skiff, the housing disassembled into its component sections, each section wrapped in moving blankets and strapped to the floor of the aluminum boat. Burl Ackerman came for both trips and for the installation, which took 2 days on a scaffold built to reach the top of the tower. A scaffold Mara built this time with the confidence of a person who has done it before and knows what holds and what doesn't. The installation required a third person for the lift, and for the lift, Mara called Darnell, the retired petty officer who had come to photograph the station in January and who had given her his number before he left. He drove down from Elizabeth City without being asked twice. He was 64 years old and had retired from 22 years of Coast Guard service, and he climbed the scaffold to the top of the signal tower on a cold March morning without hesitation. Because a man who has spent 22 years working on vessels in open water has a different relationship with heights and cold than most people maintain. And because this was the kind of work that does not require explanation when you understand what you are doing it for. The housing seated on the tower rim, with the solidity of something returning to a place it had occupied before the cast iron settling into the brackets, with a sound of metal finding metal, and Burl ran the mounting bolts down with a ratchet and checked each one twice, and when it was done, the 3 of them stood on the scaffold and looked at it, and no one said anything for a moment, because the right thing to say in that moment did not fit in words, and all 3 of them were the kind of people who knew that. Darnell said, "There it is." Burl said, "There it is." Mara looked at the housing, and then passed it out over the Atlantic, which was running a 2-foot chop under a northwest wind, and catching the low March light and turning it back in 1,000 different directions. 47 years of keeping watch from 1911 to 1958. 67 years dark. The housing back on the tower now. She said, "Thank you both." They came down off the scaffold and had coffee at the heavy table. The opening was on a Saturday in late April, a year and 4 months after Mara had first crossed the Sound in Burl's borrowed skiff and stepped onto the boat ramp with her toolbox and her father's sea bag. She had not advertised it widely. She had put a notice in the Outer Banks Sentinel and posted information on the Dare County Historic Preservation website and sent a letter to the Coast Guard's District Historical Office in Portsmouth, and left word through the network of fishing and waterman families along the island. She had told Burl and Darnell and Portia and Cecilia Pruitt from the county records office. She had told the retired surfman's family in Norfolk, who she had tracked down through the logbook, a grandson named Emmett, 47 years old, who had cried on the phone when she told him his grandfather's name was in the official watch record, and who had said he would come. She had told Sloane, who did not need telling, because Sloane was standing in the kitchen of her second-floor room at 6 in the morning on the day of the opening, making a pot of coffee with the focused attention of a person who has decided to be fully present for something. 41 people came. They came by a boat skiff and center console, and one older gentleman in a 22-foot Grady White who anchored in the shallows and waded in with his shoes in his hand. A school group from Cape Hatteras Secondary came with a teacher who had grown up hearing about the life-saving stations from her grandfather. 2 retired Coast Guardsmen came from Virginia Beach. Emmett drove from Norfolk and arrived with his wife and his teenage daughter, who had her grandfather's eyes, or Mara thought so, which may have been projection, but felt true. Emmett stood in the signal room for a long time. He stood at the east window and looked at the Atlantic, and Mara stood near the hatch and did not say anything, because this was one of those moments that belongs to the person in it and not to anyone else. And what Emmett was doing there, looking at the water his grandfather had looked at for years, was something that did not need a witness, only a room that held it properly. After a while, he turned around. He looked at the flag locker and the brass lamp mount and the windows and the walls. He said he talked about this place. He said I was maybe 8 years old, and he sat me down at the kitchen table and told me about this station, about the watches, about the war years. I thought he was telling me stories. I didn't understand he was telling me what he had done. He looked at Mara. He said, "How did you know to look behind the locker?" Mara said, "I didn't. I was looking at the structural condition of the back wall. I reached my hand in to check the gap and felt the shelf." He was quiet for a moment. He said he trusted the building to keep it until the right person came. Mara said he trusted the right person to come. The ground floor was open to visitors throughout the afternoon. The heavy table had the logbook on it, open under a glass cover to the page, with the final entry, Voss's handwriting. The last watch, the 341 lives. Beside the logbook, Sloane had framed Voss's letter and mounted it on the beadboard wall where the oilskin hooks were the original letter on acid-free backing with a small typed card noting its provenance and date. Below the letter on a separate card, Sloane had typed the passage about Cormac Calloway. Volunteer, age 53, every night. No exceptions. The removable panel in the west wall of the tower, the one Mara had fitted over the beam with the carved inscription, was open. Visitors could look through the panel at the old-growth longleaf pine with the chisel cuts still clean in the grain. Cormac Calloway, 1911. Peemaquid, Maine. Some of them touched it. Most did not. The ones who did were mostly older people who understood without being told what it means to leave your name in a wall and trust the building to keep it. The school group stood in a cluster around the table, and their teacher read them the final logbook entry, and they listened with the particular quality of attention that young people give to the past when the past has been made specific enough to be real. Not history in the abstract, but a specific man named Voss, writing a specific number on a specific day in a specific room that they were standing in right now, this room, this table, this light. One of the kids, a boy of maybe 13, with the squinting, assessing look of someone who is deciding whether to believe, something raised his hand and asked, why did he leave the money? The teacher started to answer, but Mara was closer, and the question had been pointed at the logbook, which was in front of her, and she said because he couldn't carry it with him, and he couldn't bring himself to hand it to a filing cabinet, so he trusted the building to hold it until someone came along who would know what to do with it. The boy thought about this. He said, how did he know someone would come? Mara said he didn't. He trusted that if something was worth keeping, it would be kept. The boy looked at the logbook, and then at the frame letter, and then at the beam through the removable panel in the wall. He did not say anything else. He had the look of someone filing information in a place that does not get cleared out easily. In the late afternoon, after most of the visitors had left, Mara climbed to the signal room alone. The lantern housing sat on the tower rim. Above her, the Fresnel lens mount inside it cleaned and fitted with a modern LED lamp module that Darnell had sourced from a marine supply house in Morehead City, one rated for coastal visibility at 12 nautical miles. The lamp was connected to a timer and a photocell. At dusk, it would come on automatically. It was already set. It was already waiting. She stood at the east window and looked at the Atlantic. The water was the deep blue-black that the ocean off the Outer Banks turns at the end of an April afternoon, the specific color her father had called Keeper Blue. She had thought of it as a color that meant evening was coming and the day's work was ending. Standing here, she understood it differently. Keeper Blue was not the color of ending, it was the color of the transition between watching and being watched, between the last light and the first dark. The particular moment when a keeper climbed to the tower and lit the lamp because the light was no longer sufficient and the dark was not yet complete, and someone needed to do something about the difference. She thought about her father, Derry Calloway, who had taken her out on the Miss Agnes from the time she was 4 and had let her take the helm on a calm September afternoon when she was 12 and had watched her from the stern with his arms crossed and his cap pulled low. She thought about him in his recliner on the last evening of his life, watching the Weather Channel, having known for 18 months that his heart was failing, and having chosen in his way to leave her the only thing he could give her, that she could not find herself a direction. A circled name in a notebook. A $10 piece of land that turned out to have her great great grandfather's name carved inside its walls, and a dead keeper's letter sealed behind its flag locker, and a deed restriction written in 1958 that stood up 67 years later against the full legal resources of a development company that had been trying to buy this coast one parcel at a time for 7 years. She thought about Derry's heart, which had kept beating long past what his doctors had told him to expect, long enough to take the Miss Agnes out for one more season, long enough to write in a notebook what he could not say out loud. She thought about the way he had taught her to coil a dock line, the flat spiral, not the figure 8, by silently undoing the figure 8 and doing it correctly without looking at whoever had done it wrong. She thought about what it meant to teach someone something without explaining it, to trust that the demonstration was sufficient, to trust the learner, to trust that the learning would be there when it was needed. She thought about Cormac, 53 years old, walking a cold beach every night for 3 years and 7 months. Because the work needed doing, and he was there, and he could do it. She thought about what it meant to show up every night, with no rank and no pay, and no official record, to ask for nothing, and to do the thing anyway, because the thing needed to be done. She thought about his name in the beam in the dark, inside the wall. The chisel cuts clean after 112 years. The wood around them dark as iron. The old growth pine that had been a tree before, the Outer Banks, was called the Outer Banks. She thought about Agnes at the kitchen table with the green ledger and the mechanical pencil. She thought about Eleanor Calloway, née Pruitt, who had kept the family's accounts to the penny for 40 years, because a family that does not know precisely what things are worth is a family that will not survive the lean months. She thought about the specific knowledge that lives in the hands when you have done something enough times, the knowledge of how to read a tide, how to read a sky, how to coil a line so that it will run cleanly when you need it to run. She thought about Sloane, who had come to this island to end things and had ended up beginning something instead, who was downstairs right now with a coffee mug and a laptop and the particular competence of a person who has discovered later than she might have wished that the place that made her did not stop being what it was just because she left it. She thought about Harlan Voss at the same window in September 1958. 51 years old, writing a letter he did not know if anyone would ever read. Trusting a shelf he had built behind a flag locker in a tower on a barrier island to hold the things that mattered until the right person came to hold them. The extraordinary, ordinary faith of a man who had spent 17 years being awake when others were asleep, who understood that the work of a life is not in the dramatic moments, the rescues, the 341 lives, but in the daily showing up. The watch stood, the lamp lit, the log written, the name recorded so it would not be lost. A watch is not a job. A watch is an agreement between a person and a stretch of water that the person will keep paying attention even when there is nothing to see. The old keepers understood this. They stood in towers on barrier islands for decades, looking at an ocean that was most nights empty and dark and patient and enormous. And they did not stop looking because the one night they stopped looking would be the one night a vessel went down within sight of the tower and there was no one awake to see it. Our fathers teach us this without using the word watch. They teach us by waking us up at 4:30. They teach us by handing us a helm and watching from the stern without saying anything. They teach us by writing our names in the margins of their notebooks in the months before they die, circling them with red ink and trusting us to figure out why. The sun went below the line of the land behind her. The sky above the Atlantic moved through the sequence. Yellow-orange rose, and then the keeper blue. The deep blue-black that was not the color of ending, but the color of transition. The color of the moment between the last light and the first dark, when someone had to decide to light the lamp. The lamp came on. It did not announce itself. The photocell read the light level, and the timer confirmed the hour, and the LED module in the Fresnel lens mount began to turn, and the light moved across the water in the slow rotation that is the specific language of a lighthouse. Not a message in words, but a presence, a pulse, a promise that someone was paying attention, that the dark was not unmonitored, that the water was not unwatched. Mara stood at the east window of the signal room and watched the light move across the water. 67 years since the last keeper had stood his final watch in this room and climbed down the ladder and sealed the door and crossed the sound to a desk assignment he didn't want in Elizabeth City. 67 years since the light had been dark. She stayed until the keeper blue faded to black and the stars appeared above the Atlantic, and the lamp continued its rotation steady and patient and present the way it had been for 47 years before the dark, and the way it would be now for as long as there was someone in the tower willing to stay awake. Downstairs, she heard Sloane putting water on for tea. She heard the particular sound of the old kettle on the camp stove, the one Mara had used all the months alone on the island. Now on the second floor kitchen that Sloane had organized with the efficiency of a person who has decided a space is hers and has acted accordingly. She heard the brass clock ticking on the heavy table in the old crew quarters below. Derry Calloway's clock wound every Sunday for 34 years by a man who expressed love by showing up and kept his faith by winding a clock and taught his daughter to keep a watch, not by explaining what a watch was, but by pointing at the water and trusting her to understand. She understood. She had always been paying attention. She had been paying attention since she was 4 years old, on the deck of the Miss Agnes, learning to coil a line since she was 10 at the kitchen table, learning to keep a ledger since she was 12, with her hands on the helm of a trawler, while her father watched from the stern and did not say anything because there was nothing to say, because the hands were right and the course was right and the work would continue. She took one more look at the light moving across the water. The Atlantic was dark now, the horizon invisible, only the light and the stars and the sound of the ocean being the ocean permanent and patient and indifferent and necessary. Then she climbed down the ship's ladder, down the stairs, and went to have tea with her sister.